And we are live. This is the Supper Heroes podcast, number 4, and we have a very special guest, Andrew Ardington, joining us today. Now, little introduction. How's it, Andrew? Firstly, you can say hello.
How's it, Johnny?
How's it, man? A little introduction. Andrew studied agricultural economics, if I'm correct.
Agricultural economics, yeah.
And then you became a game ranger, and now you're a builder. But you're also the emperor and CEO and founder of Regenerative Agriculture South Africa, the regenagsa.org. Is that tell us like just 1 minute of how you made that transition?
Well, I grew up on a farm, and then I was a game ranger, and then I ran a lodge in a wilderness area. And then I came to Cape Town, and I moved away from farming. But I have a very regenerative-focused uncle who's a farmer. He's retired now, though. And he kept me in the game during my year off. And then 3.5 years ago, together with my sisters and my mother, we bought a small holding, and we got some cattle, and that got the regenerative juices flowing again. Everywhere I looked and all the research I did, regenerative agriculture came back a win-win-win on so many of the major issues in our country and in the world. Whether it was human health and skyrocketing chronic diseases, whether it was environmental health, and specifically the focus on too much carbon in the atmosphere rather than in the soil. And regenerative agriculture just ticked all these boxes. And what I wanted to do was, what could I do that's best for promoting regenerative agriculture in South Africa? If I just went and sold my house in Cape Town and bought a farm and got farming, I could change that farm, but I wasn't going to, in a short space of time, change lots. And I started doing research, and I found out there were more regenerative farmers in South Africa than I thought, of a kind. There are many different kinds of regenerative farmers. And I thought that the best thing I could do was create a community for these people, for them to communicate with each other, to share their problems, their successes, and then also to allow easy access for new entrants into the game. So, I'm a guy, I'm like thinking of doing this, but I think I'm all by myself. But little do I know, like 20 Ks away, there's another farmer who's already been doing this for 5 years. And if I can meet him, I can take some massive shortcuts, and I can, have a beer with somebody who can share their issues with me, rather than, most farmers, their only exposure is to the guy selling them chemicals and fertilizer. And that's the guy who's,
he does not want you. He does not want you to go into regenerative agriculture.
To create another channel so guys have someone to talk to. And so that was how the whole thing came about. And then I discovered something on Facebook called groups, which I didn't know about, because I met all these guys working around soil and carbon and regenerative agriculture on Facebook through groups. So I started a group, and it's great. We've now got like 700 South Africans on a group talking to each other about regenerative agriculture.
That's awesome.
And that's really what we're trying to do, and we're taking it from there. And then I've also. Sorry, John, you wanted to say something?
I got like 1,000 questions. So well, if carry on, and then
I'll just like finish my journey. So then I also met these other guys who have been working behind the scenes in regenerative agriculture. They are agronomists and academics, and they were in the process of forming an entity called Integra Food with Integrity. I've started to work closely with them and become aligned with them specifically in one aspect, Integrity Link, which is their farm outreach component. And so that is really developing at a deeper level, with actual scientists being available to work with farmers, agronomists. and also starting a fund to help people pay for the transition from regenerative agriculture, from conventional agriculture through to regenerative agriculture, and then developing a concept called the I-score, which is a measure of how regenerative a farm is. And this is the first one of these in the world, because unlike the existing types of measures, they're not actually measures, they're certificates, and you get certified as being organic. And there's either you are organic or you're not organic. You can't be 99% organic. Whereas on our regenerative system, we believe that it's about getting as many farmers and as many hectares regenerative as possible because of all the positive spin-offs from that. So we don't want to say, okay, you're 99% regenerative, so you can't be in the game.
Yeah, you're not in the game.
You're saying you can be 5% regenerative and you're in the game. And we're going to help you move along that scale to get to 95%. And there's no other system of measuring agriculture that's working along those lines. All the others are an all or nothing system.
Got it.
And then the final thing that part of this whole ecosystem that we're creating is the food hubs, and creating food clubs via a food hub. So there are already a number of food clubs in South Africa, a handful of them, probably like 15 in total, 15, 20, and they're kind of operating independently, maybe connected, but they're not really connected, and it's actually quite difficult to start a food club. If you wanted to start a food club, Johnny, you'd have to go find all the farmers, you'd have to work out how they were going to get all their produce to you, then you'd have to work out, well, how am I going to get all this information about what products I've got together, how am I going to put prices on that, and how am I going to give that to the people who I've invited to be part of my food club, my buying group, et cetera, and then how am I going to manage the whole process, the admin behind it. So we've been building a website, which is basically a food club in a box, and we're a few weeks away from launching that, and that's the very exciting final part of this regenerative ecosystem that we're working to put together here in South Africa. And I'm very privileged to have met a lot of players in a short space of time. I mean, we're talking, all of this has happened in a year.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And there are all these people who are putting in all this work for no gain at the moment. I mean, they're doing this because they believe in it. Maybe down the line, there'll be some income. But at the moment, they're doing it because they believe in it. And it's good stuff, it's the kind of stuff that people can do because they believe in it.
Well, let's talk about some of the beliefs. So, that is amazing, by the way, to have the full ecosystem, because obviously you need the farmers getting the skills and people wanting to buy the stuff, and they'll feed each other. But let's take a few steps back and go to why. And I spent some time scouring your website, which is here in that little banner for anyone who wants to check it out. But you've mentioned the carbon cycle, the water cycle, depleted soils, rebuilding soils. So let's talk about carbon, because a lot of people think that if you eat beef, you're wasting 1 million liters of water per steak, and you're basically plowing a hole in the atmosphere. So talk about regenerative agriculture and how it impacts the carbon cycle.
So the science is like statistics. There's lies in statistics, and there's lies in science. And you can do research in a way that you wanted to find stuff. And most of agricultural science is reductionist. Everything gets reduced to put in a box to go in a straight line. But biology doesn't work like that. Biology is a web, and biology is complex interconnections and things that are very difficult to measure. So scientists don't like it. They like to do, I want to do an experiment and put this chemical in and take it out and see what happens. They want to treat nature like it's Lego, that you can put these pieces together, then take them apart and put them together, and you didn't lose anything in the process. Well, the sad reality is you lose quite a lot in the process. And the thing behind all of this, the whole natural cycle, is carbon. And carbon, most people, it wasn't even discussed in farming. If your scientists would measure your soils, they'd measure your nitrogen, your potassium, your phosphorus, and maybe your zinc and your boron, but probably not even that. And then they would go along and tell you what you must add on your fields. Okay. But the whole thing is underpinned by carbon. Okay, most of a plant is made up of carbon. Most of you is carbon. And where does that carbon come from? It doesn't come from the earth. We don't mine it out the earth. We mine it out the sky. Now, some might say that our single biggest problem, our single biggest threat to our existence right now is that there's too much carbon in the sky. So if we have a natural system that mines carbon out of the sky, let's really promote that system. And so, I was watching a YouTube clip the other day of a farmer in Australia, and he was saying, he had government scientists coming to speak to him about his farm and what he should do for the last 40 years. And until climate change became a massive thing, the word carbon had never been mentioned in a meeting on his farm ever. And there's new science that's been done. Some amazing people like Christine Jones in Australia. And she came up with this concept of the liquid carbon pathway. And carbon not only is the thing that makes up most of a plant, but the whole economy of a growing plant is around carbon. And carbon is taken out the atmosphere from CO2 in the process of photosynthesis. It then goes down into the plant to build the plant, but also the plant exudes it via its roots in the form of carbohydrates to buy minerals and water from the microbiome around the roots. Okay, so there's some bacteria and some fungi there, and they've got nitrogen, and they've got calcium, and they've got zinc, and they've got boron, and they've got selenium, all these things that a plant needs to be healthy. And the money that it pays for is it exudes sugars out of its roots. Those things eat the sugars, and then the plant absorbs those minerals that it needs.
So is that that's the process when they talk about carbon sequestration? Is that's
it's part of the process, yeah. So that carbon is now going into the soil, and some of it will be respired by those little microbes that are eating it, but some of it is trapped in the soil, and that's carbon sequestration. Also, there is part of the plant, like the roots go into the soil, grow in the soil, and they're made of carbon, and they die, and they're now in the soil, and they slowly decompose. This is the whole process of carbon sequestration. And interestingly, you talk about cattle and about how people talk about the carbon issue. If you look at the history of the evolution of our soils, ruminants evolved about 40, 50 million years ago. And they changed the whole carbon setup, the whole carbon cycle, by putting more carbon in the ground via the grasslands. Ruminants and grasslands developed side by side. Yeah. And they put more carbon in the ground than had ever been put in. A forest is an amazing store of carbon, but actually most of that carbon is stored in the plant rather than in the ground. And the grass, together with the ruminants, built up these massive carbon stores and made the environment that we evolved in as human beings, the grasslands that we evolved on. And we changed over the millennia to evolve into modern humans. That all happened because of grasslands, and grasslands happened because of their relationship with ruminants and how they managed to change the whole carbon situation and store massive amounts of carbon underground. You look at America and the prairies, the middle of America. The topsoil was meters deep there, all made by grasslands mowed by bison and elk and pronghorn antelope for millions of years. And those grasslands put tons and tons and tons of carbon in the soil. And really, if we want to talk about putting carbon in the air, we don't talk about cattle. Let's talk about farming, like plowing, tillage. That is really, over the last 10,000 years, us starting off with our little Urdu plow, the little piece of wood, basically, sort of modified hoe, going all the way through to these modern machines that get dragged behind these massive tractors that are more like tanks. There's a lot of military analogy in industrial agriculture. But those guys have turned that soil and released all that carbon and put carbon in the sky. People don't realize that, okay, so the main cause of our atmospheric carbon issue at the moment is burning fossil fuels. That's putting more stuff in the sky than we know. And also, with the advent of fracking and natural gases, that's putting more methane in the sky than we've ever even dreamed of. But
Sure.
like that only started after World War II. Okay. Prior to that, we had 10,000 years of agriculture. And that 10,000 years of agriculture put more carbon in the sky than up till now fossil fuels have put in the sky.
That's nuts. Okay, I didn't know that. Wow.
So let's use that agriculture to get the carbon back down underground.
Okay. And so if I understand what you're saying, basically by protecting the soil and I think like using cover crops and various other things, you can suppress the release of carbon and basically reverse carbon, what is it, like carbon emissions basically, or offset carbon emissions, trap the carbon basically. Cool. I mean, that is an insane thing that no one actually knows. I mean, we spoke about investing in regenerative agriculture last week, and I kind of think that maybe that was a jump too soon, because this is the stuff people need to know before they even think about throwing their money into it. It's literally reversing climate change by doing the thing everyone thinks causes climate change. So, so look, I'm sure we could talk about carbon for the rest of the day, but you've also said something about the water cycle. And I think I mentioned before we went on live that there was some ecosystem stuff around that as well. So talk to us a bit about the impact conventional agriculture has on the water cycle, and then what the difference is between that and regenerative agriculture.
Okay, so I mean, tenets of industrial agriculture, of conventional agriculture as it's bizarrely called, are plowing, okay, which basically smashes the house in which the biology lives in the soil, okay, and releases a massive amount of carbon, which is not a great idea. And organic matter is consumed in that process, and that organic matter being consumed releases the carbon, and the carbon is released into the air. So if you look, your average farm, okay, you and I live in the Western Cape, and if you take out a drive on the N2 and you're driving through Caledon and those places, for 8 months of the year, the ground is bare and facing the sun and facing the wind and facing the rain. And, one thing almost every country in the world has in common is we all have the same single greatest export. We all export more topsoil than anything else. Whether you're in America, Australia, or South Africa, or India, we export more topsoil than anything else. And, this is just going on the whole time, mostly through the way we farm. Now, organic matter has which is basically carbon, okay? Organic matter, carbon, have a very good relationship with water in soil. And the statistic is something around the region of, for every 1% increase in organic matter in your soil can hold a further 70,000 liters. That's like a big, giant swimming pool per hectare. Okay. So, and if you can, through good farming practice, take your carbon content in your soil, your organic carbon, from 1% to say 4 or 5%, okay, you've now gone up 4 times 70,000 liters on your soil. And what that means is basically every major rainfall event can get sucked into your soil, and there's very little runoff and very little flooding downstream. Right. And the problem is that there are 2 water cycles. The one water cycle is the large water cycle, which includes the ocean and large evaporation, and then storm clouds come over and dump on the land. The other water cycle is the small water cycle, which is mostly from transpiration, actually. Plants sucking water out the ground and releasing it through the leaves in the process of photosynthesis. And that is what drives the small water cycle. But if you're in Caledon and for 8 months of the year there are no plants in the soil, there is no small water cycle. And lo and behold, you're going to impact on the rain. And as Alan Savory says, droughts do not create bare soil. Bare soil creates droughts. And the impact of bare soil and not having your soil covered, protected from the sun and the rain, is phenomenal. You can go and buy some compost at the hardware store down the road. and spread it out on the ground. It'll be nice and almost black and rich and full of organic matter. Leave it there for a few months and come back, it'll all be grey. The sun will have killed all the organic matter. All of that carbon would have gone from being trapped inside that organic matter into the atmosphere. And it's gone. And that's how we treat our soil. We treat it like it's dirt. We don't treat it like it's a living entity that we need to feed and we need to nourish and we need to make this thing work for us and do so many things. Not only provide all the minerals our plants need, but keep the water in the soil and fix the small water cycle and make us get smaller incidents of rain rather than infrequent, massive downpours of rain, which is happening all across the world now.
So you're saying that if you have looked after your soil properly, like the dry season might feel like the dry season on the surface, but actually under the soil, it's not that dry.
So the Rodale Institute, which began in America in the 1960s, I think, maybe even earlier. Earlier in the 1940s, was the first organic. There's a private place that was set up to do organic farming when industrial agriculture was just getting going. There were a few outspoken peoples across the world. So Albert Howard, it was a famous British scientist who was very against modern agriculture and very don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need this organic stuff. And Rodale began this. And one of the things Rodale began is 40 years ago. They literally just turned 40 now. They began an experiment running a conventional maize field next to a regenerative organic maize field. Okay. And they've run these two fields side by side for 40 years. And every drought year in that 40 years, the regenerative field has outperformed the industrial field. The field that's not getting any nitrogen, not getting any phosphorus, not getting any potassium, not getting any of the stuff that the industrial world says we have to put on our fields, has outperformed in every single drought year over 40 years. And over those 40 years, the big criticism against regenerative agriculture is that it can't compete on yield. Well, over those 40 years, it's competed on yield because of the way it outcompetes in the dry years. And one of the things with climate change is we're just getting more and more dry years. We now, rather than having 3 dry years, we have 7 dry years. And so we really got to work out how to farm in dry years.
Yeah, I mean, there's a parallel there between, like a lot of the time I've spent looking at what happens in the gut, and the big argument is do we take all these supplements, which to me sound like chemical fertilizer. Or do we look after the biome and have it just produce all those micronutrients and chemicals naturally? Because if you don't have your potassium the one day, then you fall apart. Whereas if you're just looking after yourself, eating natural organic matter, it's almost like the garden analogy that Sally Ann Creed gave years ago. It was your gut is exactly like the soil. So it sounds like it's exactly the same thing, minus the water. I think people still need water. We couldn't handle a drought as well as a soil patch could.
No, totally. I think it goes back to my Lego comment earlier. Modern science says, okay, we've taken the nutrition, we've edited the nutrition out of food to such a degree we need to start taking supplements. Okay, but that's playing Lego. Food is a complex entity, and there are all these amino acids and polyphenols and all these other little bits and pieces that all come together. And then, there's an element called selenium, okay, which we require in minuscule proportions, okay? And plants can't get that if their microbiome isn't in good shape, okay? And they're the two microbiomes. There's the plant's microbiome happening around its roots, and ours happening in our gut, and both of them are very, very closely related. And I think, when modern science has finally worked all this out, the research into the human gut microbiome is 15 years old. It's really only in the last 15 years that we've started paying attention to it. And the microbiome, it's the source of our immune system. It produces most of our feel-good drugs. We all think the brain is what is impacting us, but that serotonin that makes you feel good, made in your tummy, and make thanks to all these other dudes who live inside your tummy that are not part of you. They came into you.
Yeah.
And they're fixing all of that. And it's that same job that's going on, that microbiome that's getting the selenium out of the soil and giving it to the root in the plant, is then doing the reverse inside our gut. It's taking the selenium out of the plant we're eating and putting it into our system and making it available to our system. And
Sure.
The problem is with the modern industrial agricultural system, we've destroyed the plant's ability to get all the nutrients it needs to take up and all the complicated biology it needs to take into itself. First step wrong. Okay, so now you've got a plant that does less. Then we process it all. Okay, and this belief that we are so clever. I mean, we have this God complex where we can go along and we can take these plants to pieces and we can put them back together in whatever way we want, and we haven't lost anything along the way.
Yeah.
And I mean, the latest craziness is this fake meat, impossible meat.
Impossible burger, because it is impossible to make meat.
Yeah, that is made up of 20 different ingredients, okay?
Yeah.
And of those 20 ingredients, only 2 are natural. The other ones have already gone through some processing process before they got into that impossible meat.
Well, this is a fantastic. Can I stop you here, because this is I wanted to chat to someone about this forever. Okay, so look, and I have the utmost respect for a lot of the vegan movement. I'm not vegan, but I have gone off dairy. But okay, this Impossible Burger for me is a symbol of like missing the point, because I want to know like how much of the environment are you actually saving if you eat these grains. Sure, you're not eating factory farmed beef, which is already like a great step, well done. Don't eat factory farmed anything, in my opinion. But if these if the ingredients that they're using in the Impossible Burger are not farmed regeneratively, you're still contributing to the problem. Is that right?
You talk of factory farming, and when we talk of factory farming, we think pigs and cows kept in horrendous conditions. Okay. But a modern corn farm, a modern soy farm, is a factory farm. Okay. And those 2 crops basically constitute all processed food. If you go look, of the 20 ingredients, 12 of them will come from those 2 crops. It'll be corn syrup and then this denatured this and that, and you reduce it all goes back. It was all made from a corn somewhere.
Yeah, it's corn oil for kicks. Yeah.
Yeah, oil. I mean, that was the start of the bad news when we were told that animal fats were killing us, and we invented margarine, and polyunsaturated oils paid for this massive drive to take place to change the whole way we ate. And that was the sort of kickoff of America's obesity problem, closely followed by Britain's. The graphs follow each other very closely as those 2 countries led the charge on this. Then it went to Australia. Then it came to South Africa. I can well remember my mother telling my father he couldn't eat butter anymore. We had to change to margarine. Thankfully, she forgot about that after about 6 months, and we went back to eating butter. Yeah,
but
so
you were talking about the corn and the soy.
That's all factory farmed.
Yeah. That's
all. It's a monocrop. It's farmed with chemicals, the fertilizers, all man-made. That is. Although there isn't the animal welfare aspect of it, it's as bad as a factory farm, and it's as bad for us. And the problem is you're not getting those plants that don't have their full complement of minerals and of all the little bits and pieces that make up nutrition, and then we're using those to make food from. Really what we've got to do, and this is, you've always been promoting this, is whole foods. We've got to go back to, and I love your supper heroes, and it's like, you're a hero because you cook your own supper. The one upside of coronavirus and lockdown is that people started cooking again, because they were at home, they were with their families, They had more time on their hands because they couldn't go to work, they couldn't go to gym, they couldn't do all the things they normally did that stopped them from spending time, and they started buying ingredients and cooking again. And that's and we'll get back to that. It's all fine to be a vegetarian or a vegan or whatever and think you're saving the world, but if you're eating processed foods, you're not saving anything. You're just creating large medical bills for your country further down the line. And you just got to go look at the United States of America. I mean, the United States of America is the king of processed foods. Processed foods, fast foods, tomato, it's all being manufactured in a lab to maximize the sugars, maximize the fats, these reward pathways that make you just want to eat more and more and more. And, it reminds me of that Bob Marley song of "Me belly full, but me hungry." Because you are hungry, you're not getting any nutrition, and so it just goes down that line, and that just ends up costing a lot of money. You look at America now; they spend like significantly more per capita on health than any other country in the world, and in the average year they rank 17th in World Health Stats.
Yeah, I mean, we were rated the worst. South Africa was rated the unhealthiest country in the world. Well, look, and it's not just chronic health. So we have obviously a massive HIV problem, but like on their grading on the World Health Organization, I think their grading system, we were the number one. So it's super relevant here as well.
If you look at us, okay, we should be pretty bad because we have allowed as a country and a government for our staple crop, maize, okay, which is the staple backbone of the diet for the majority of South Africans. We have allowed that to become a totally GMO crop. We have which, if you look at GMO, it's really just about protecting the industrial industry. What are the changes that they made to these plants? They didn't make them more nutritious. They didn't make them do wonderful things for us. They made them resistant to their own sprays, to their own chemicals, so that you could put more of their chemicals on to these plants and they wouldn't die and the weeds would die. Because you had to put more chemicals on because the weeds are becoming resistant to those sprays after years and years of being sprayed by these things. So we have allowed the entire maize industry in South Africa, 95+% of it, to become a GMO industry with all the associated chemicals. And from a regenerative perspective, those plants are not getting all the nutrients they need. So how can the humans who eat those plants, even if they eat them in the whole form, get all the nutrients they need? And they're not eating them in the whole form. It's being processed and turned into refined maize. So half the nutrients are being left behind on the pavement anyway. It really is a serious problem in this country.
No, it is. And yeah, I mean, that's a large portion of what Real Meal Revolution was trying to address. And so just back onto the maize thing. So before we went live, you were talking about the states. And I see that one of the topics on your site is grain-fed versus grass-fed. And you threw out some crazy stats about how much grain we grow for beef. Do you want to touch on that?
The whole thing about industrial agriculture is that is for years they've always come back at any arguments against them by the organic movements, by regenerative people more recently, that your farming can't feed the world. But the reality is their farming doesn't feed the world. If you look at the UN stats, 70% of the people of the world are fed off non-industrialized farming. That's China, India, South America, Africa. There's very little industrialized farming in those areas. And those small farms there that are still using old-fashioned methods of farming and could really benefit so greatly from getting the modern science around regenerative farming added to those old-fashioned knowledge bases. They're feeding 70% of the world. Now, so that leaves us industrial agriculture that claims it has to poison the world in order to feed it, is only feeding 30% of the world. So then if you take that and you go study the American system, basically their two big crops are corn and soy. But if you look at corn, 33% of the crop every year goes into producing ethanol. So we now use petrol, lots of it, to grow a maize crop. We then harvest that maize crop and losing energy all the way along the way, make it into petrol to put in our cars. I mean, it really is unbelievable. It boggles the mind.
Why don't they use sugar for that, by the way? Because sugar surely converts into ethanol much faster. It's probably the only use for it.
Yeah, there is. I mean, in Brazil, they produce a lot of ethanol from sugar, but the United States doesn't have the capacity to grow lots of sugar. That's the wrong climate. They grow sugar down in the southeast, but not much. In Florida and down there, you can get some sugar cane. But in the vast majority of their country is the Midwest, which is producing their grains and they can't produce sugar cane there. But most of the sugar in America, so once again, back to processed foods and industrializing, etc., is corn syrup.
Yes.
And I mean, I grew up on a sugar farm, and I come from that background. It was a massive blow for the world sugarcane farmers when Coca-Cola changed its recipe to go from getting its sugar from sugarcane to getting its sugar from corn syrup.
Wow.
So corn syrup is a massive, and if you go look on whether it's your cereal or whatever food you're eating out of a box rather than a whole food, go look at it and see how often you'll find corn syrup as a primary ingredient.
Sorry, I took you off track there because you were about to talk about the 30% of the grain goes to.
The next biggest use of maize is feeding cattle. Okay. And at the end of the day, it comes down to like 15% of the American maize crop is left to making processed foods. And I say processed foods because you can't eat it. It's not available as food to a human being without being processed either through a cow, a pig, a chicken, or through a factory and a lab. And all of that feed is then given to those cattle. Now, cattle are not designed to eat grains. Cattle are designed to eat plant cellulose and break down plant cellulose in their phenomenally complex digestive system, using all the microbes. The same microbes that feed us are the microbes that feed the cattle. But they can actually make food out of grass. We cannot make food out of grass. They have a very advanced gut that does that for them. And then we go along, and for the last 5 months of a cow's life, we cram it with foods that is not designed to eat. And we put it in a situation where it lives in its own fecal matter. And these animals get sick. And they have to be given regular antibiotics in order to stop them from dying and not putting on weight while they're in that feedlot. And so that's actually a sick animal that we're sending to slaughter.
Yeah.
And the big things that change when we change from feeding a cow grass to feeding it grains and all of that process is the types of fats in the cow. Now, the massive problem for human beings is inflammation. If you look at our chronic diseases that 70 years ago didn't register on any hospital's death list and are now the primary causes of death in every single hospital in the modern world. Okay. So, i.e., we have created these diseases as epidemics step by step with modern agriculture. And many of them relate back to inflammation and how the body reacts to inflammation. And we have it now again here in coronavirus. Where your people you interviewed 2 weeks ago, or whenever it was.
Dr. Silas,
talking about inflammation and how this inflammation and over-inflammation is causing problems for doctors trying to treat people with coronavirus. And when it comes down to fats, I mean, the simplest version, there are lots of other more complicated ones, is the omega-3 and the omega-6s. Now, omega-3 reduces inflammation reaction. Omega-6 increases inflammation reaction. And the ratio should be like 4-1 or 3-1 or 2-1 around there. So more omega-6 in your body, but pretty close to omega-3. Now, if you're taking animals that are coming out of industrial feedlots, cattle, you're pushing this way up. You're getting figures, they range, but 10 to 20 times rather than 2 to 3 times. And so what we've done there is another example of how we've changed food, we've interfered with biology and with nature, and we've made a food that makes us get more inflamed. Yeah. And this is exactly the same thing we've done with other processed foods, and the pushing of refined carbohydrates also causes inflammation. And if we could eat in such a way that we reduced inflammation, the impact it would have on human health and human well-being, and not just physical, mental well-being, and then the impact that we would have on our health bills of our countries would be phenomenal. Okay, and that's where we need to be moving. We need to be looking at food as medicine. Okay, and going, how should we be approaching our food? This is what the government should be asking these questions, because at the end of the day, the government's carrying the can here.
They're subsidizing the agriculture that's screwing them on the other side, basically.
and paying for the hospital bills at the end. And while I'm putting in my boot on industrial agriculture, this little segue here, talking about paying on things. So, at the moment, there's a big drive. People are trying to get developing countries to adopt more and more monocrop, row cropping, industrial agriculture, GMO, accept GMO stuff, etc., etc. Stop from each farmer growing so many different things, get specialized, etc., etc. In a nutshell, they're trying to push them towards industrial farming. They're trying to push them towards the green revolution. But the green revolution, wherever it goes, just causes bankruptcy. Okay, because
can you just explain a little bit about the green revolution? Because I don't know what that is.
So the green revolution was when we invented fertilizer, basically.
Okay.
So we had this problem of farmers were not looking after their fields sufficiently. They weren't putting in enough green manure. They weren't grazing that with cattle and putting dung back into the fields. And they were trying to get too many crops out of their fields, and the productivity was declining. And we first tried to solve that by shipping in guano, bird guano, from every island around the world into Europe. And then that started to drop off supply and not really become a viable option anymore. And then Haber and Bosch invented this process of making, they invented it for gunpowder. But they could get nitrogen out of the atmosphere. It's stuck together, two molecules like this, and split them and then make them available. Okay, so we could produce synthetic nitrogen to feed plants. And this began the Industrial Revolution, where we could farm badly and just pour on nitrogen, okay, which was a fossil fuel derived entity, which was cheap. Fossil fuels have always been very cheap because we've never ever paid the full cost for them. The whole damage that they do as we use them, that bill just gets kicked on to our grandchildren. Every generation's done, they've never paid for it. And that's what makes fossil fuels cheap. Fossil fuels aren't cheap, they're very expensive. They carry this big tag called climate change on their back. And so we used that, and we made this way of making cheap energy and cheap food. And we then, that was the Green Revolution, that we could now make so much food, hunger would never be a problem again. We immediately caused problems and changed things, and resulted in that crazy situation, as I said earlier, where 15% of the American maize crop is going to make food for people. The rest is going into some other industrial process.
So how does the Green Revolution cause bankruptcy?
Because you have to spend a huge amount of money on inputs, and if you're a small farmer, you don't have money. Okay, so right. I mean, the worst example is in India. Okay, so they managed to convince large parts of India to change to growing GMO cotton. You can't grow GMO crops without lots of inputs. Okay, firstly, they need the fertilizer, they need the sprays, the chemicals to protect them. Okay, because you basically mess with the biology of an environment so badly when you go to a monocrop, that it just, you create the perfect breeding ground for the pests that are living off that monocrop. And there've been scores of suicides across the Indian small Indian cotton farming industry, because these people have been driven into bankruptcy by having to go this route. And because there's so many extra costs, so many of them externalized, you can only do this stuff if you have large government backing. Okay, so you look at who the citadels of the green revolution and industrial agriculture, the United States or North America and Europe. Okay, and if you add up all the different kinds of subsidies and supports and whatever that the government gets involved in, it comes to something like $100 billion a year. Okay, between the farmers of those two continents being supported to produce their environment destroying food, and in my opinion, their health crisis creating food. $100 billion a year. Okay, now you come along and you get all these foundations coming along and promoting in Malawi and in various countries in Southeast Asia that they must change to farming this stuff in a way that only makes sense if you've got $100 billion pumping in from the government.
Yeah, if you're being subsidized.
And there's no one being subsidized in Malawi. And so it's not working. And it just leads to people losing their farms, becoming bankrupt, and that all leads to suicides. It's happening in the United States. The stats are each year, it varies a little bit, but the average farmer in America is going to make $1,000 profit a year. The average farmer. That means more than half of them are making a loss that year. Okay, wow. And the only reason they survive is because of government subsidies. Government pay you up to zero. Okay, so every year you make food, you do your job as a farmer, and then you get paid to zero. So basically, you went nowhere.
That's insane. That is insane. I did not know that.
It is insane, and it's terrifying. It's not just insane. It's terrifying.
Wow. Okay. So that's. I mean, we started off on grass-fed versus grain-fed, but that got deep. So just a little, So the chef's argument on grain-fed versus grass-fed slightly different. And I say the chefs. So when I say chef, I mean like flavor argument, because grass-fed has much better flavor, but less fat typically, and it's slightly tougher. And it's not that it's tougher; it's just less marbled. So and then grain-fed. Did I say grass-fed? I meant grass-fed about the previous one. And then grain-fed is typically much easier to marble, but the flavor is obviously a lot milder. And like the classic example is Wagyu. And I know that Wagyu is obviously genetic. It's a genetic variety that accumulates more fat, but the way that they do it is they give it everything that makes it fat to make it even more fat. And so just like the short version of grass-fed versus grain-fed from an environmental perspective, you're saying that grain-fed's like the devil.
Well, I mean, grain-fed is one of the devils. Conventionally raised beef, as opposed to regeneratively raised beef, is also quite environmentally damaging. It causes a lot of erosion. It causes a lot of carbon to be released into the atmosphere. As opposed to if you have planned grazing and you run a farm. A farm. Historically, people would say, "I'm a beef farmer." Then the more enlightened people started to say, "I'm a grass farmer." The beef is a byproduct of producing grass, because if I don't produce good grass, and then now the even more enlightened are going, "No, I'm a soil farmer. I'm farming the biology in the soil, and I get my soil biology right that fixes my grass, and then I get great quality beef, and I don't have a huge environmental ticket that goes with it." And so. Most cattle are still produced by conventional farming, not by regenerative farming. And in a country like South Africa, of commercial beef, there's a huge non-commercial herd in South Africa, cattle in tribal areas, and so this conversation excludes all of them because they don't end up in a feedlot, and they don't end up. But of the cattle that are farmed commercially, 95% end up in a feedlot.
Yes.
Okay? Yeah. That feedlot has, on top of the farming method with which the animals were raised, has its own environmental crisis problem. And part of that, which is ignored, is the human health impact. Yeah, and the fat is very different. You can actually tell, before cooking, if you presented with the fat will be yellow in a grass-fed animal because it's full of keratin. Okay.
Yes.
The fat in a grain-fed animal will be white, and there is a lot more marbling, and marbling is simply fat that has gone into the muscle.
So it's like slightly more sick, slightly sicker. It's more obese.
It's obese. It's entirely obese. You're eating an obese animal.
Yeah. So and so I always laugh because there's the sun in this. I go to Betty's Bay, which is just down the road. We go there on holiday, and in Claremont there's a biltong shop there, and it's got this massive sign out front that just says "Heel Vet Biltong." It's like, and that's like their main calling card. It's like you come here, you get real beef. But let's talk about the consumer side, because everyone watching this is like, cool, this is great, the best way to farm, but we know how to buy like grass-fed beef. I know there are a few outlets in Cape Town like Frankie Fenner that sell grass-fed, and basically, I'm going to have this conversation, but I'm going to do a garlic demonstration later where I'm showing people how to roast garlic. I'm going to go to Pick and Pay and buy garlic to roast. So like, how do we get this stuff? And I know that you've got a project you mentioned earlier that you're working on, but like, how does a consumer buy, instead of organic and grass-fed, how do they buy regenerative?
It's difficult. And you have to work hard at it, and you've got to be aware of what's going on, and you've got to try hard, and hence the food clubs that have evolved already, and the further food clubs we wish to evolve, because we're all trapped, just like the beef farmer. If 95% of the beef are going through the feedlots, you really don't have much choice but to send your beautifully raised beef to the feedlot, because there's only 5% left, and how do you access that 5% market? And just on the other side of that, you're the consumer. Where do you find that 5%, and who's it going to, and how is it being accessed? It's very difficult. And we need to work at this together. This is a project under creation. And this is part of our food club, is that together we want to build an alternative food chain. A food chain that focuses on the health of the people eating it and focuses on the environment. And those two issues enables people, as you say, people say, how can I live regeneratively? It's actually quite hard, because there are very few producers and they're not in the mainstream. Like the 95% of the meat, Woolworths, Checkers, Pick and Pay, Spar, those main avenues of food and food distribution are not involved in this. And they're not going to become involved in this until there's consumer pressure. And part of what we want to do via our food clubs is create that consumer pressure. Create pressure that these bigger old-fashioned retailers think, hell, we have to change also. Because ultimately our goal is that we don't just want people who can afford this high-end meat to be eating regeneratively. We want everyone to be eating regeneratively, and we want South Africa's entire maize crop to be produced regeneratively. And it can. There need to be some changes, and we've got to make those changes. And so we have to sell to consumers that they must be part of this thing. And so, if I look at my journey, I started off, the first thing I could get was some regenerative beef from Farmer Angus, because I knew him anyway. And then I found out about the food club, so I can add that to my offering. Then I found out about eggs, and I can add those to what I'm getting, and then slowly start to increase. The hardest, of course, is your perishables, your vegetables, etc., because the vast majority of market gardening in South Africa is not done in an organic, regenerative way.
Right.
Sorry.
So Farmer Angus is like one of the brands that we can trust. But you said something very interesting now about regenerative versus organic. So organic, organic is this thing, this like gold standard that everyone aspires to, but like you're saying that regenerative is not
in
necessary.
my opinion, it used to be the gold standard. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has downgraded it to such a degree to make it mainstream, brought under pressure from all the industrial agriculture companies that also do organic farming in order to get some of that higher price market. That it's hardly organic anymore. But let's forget about that part of it. Let's go to the stuff that really is organic. Okay, you can use sprays and things in USDA approved organic. It's hardly organic. But let's go to other certifications that are. The big problem is they allow tilling. Okay, you're allowed to turn the soil in order to control weeds, and they have to rely. These big organic producers rely heavily on this because they can't spray weedicides to control the weeds. But the problem is like first principle of regenerative agriculture is do not disturb the soil. If I go drive a big DC-10 tractor through your house, every couple of months, you're not going to be living happily. And that's what we do when we plow until we drive a big tractor through the house of the soil biology. And so regenerative is basically organic in the old-fashioned sense, not the USDA sense. But the prime goal is to grow your soil. You've got to protect your soil. So it's organic with a soil protection criteria.
Right.
And I sometimes say this, that had organic not been hijacked by commercial interests, we really wouldn't know what regenerative agriculture is. It wouldn't exist because organic would have done the job. But organic was hijacked by commercial interests. And then it was about getting food to the consumer that doesn't have this and it doesn't have this and it doesn't have this and it doesn't have this in it. There was no consideration given to the environmental impact of producing that food. And it was degenerating the soil. And that's why you'll see these studies that are, get such widespread publicity because the industrial agriculture people are spreading them, saying that organic is as bad as industrial when it comes to carbon and these issues. It is, because they're plowing the smithereens out of the fields. They're tilling them. And then they're tilling them again when the crop's growing to kill the weeds growing between them. So regenerative is really organic with an environmental protection attached to it. Cool. And the whole aim is that, if you look at any natural system, it's either regenerating or it's degenerating. Okay? And we want a natural system. We want food produced naturally that comes with its full quotient of nutrition and with no harmful substances in it. Okay. Now, in order to do that, we've got to look after our soil. We've got to look after the nature and make sure it regenerates and keeps regenerating. As soon as you stop doing that and you break those principles, it starts to degenerate. And that's really the organic thing. Organic got hijacked.
Yeah, got it. So now so you're launching this tech startup basically in a couple weeks time, which I'm very excited about, by the way. Like take me, basically send me, I'm in. Okay. And so the food club idea is awesome, and like you said, there are 15 food clubs. And so just tell us a little bit about the tech, like what people will be able to do and how consumers will be able to interact with their food club owners, because your market's the food club owners and then their market is the end users. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you think about it, if you want to start something new, a new food chain, you've got to work out how you're going to get your consumers. Okay. Now I can start an online shop, but there's so many of those already. I'm not going to get that. Okay. And there's so much competition, and all the main supermarkets are now online anyway. Okay. And so we want a person-to-person marketing strategy. Okay, so we want to find somebody at a church or at a school or at some club that has a special interest in food. Okay, and generally the people who start these clubs, some family member got sick and had some disease, and they got fixed by changing their diet. Okay, or their health improved by changing their diet, and these people develop a special interest in food, and understand the concept of food as medicine, and so they're prepared to put in the legwork to find the food with medicine, the rare stuff that we have at this situation in our life, and we want to change it to being everywhere. And so you get that person to form the food club and get in their group of people to source through that food club. And then our whole web application is about making it as easy as possible for John O'Proudfoot to start a food club. And the first thing is giving you access to the existing producers. And we hope that as we get, somebody phones us from Caledon and says they want to start a food club in Caledon, we hope that they can introduce us to more producers. And we build this society, this group of people, one farmer, one food club at a time. And we build it together, and we make it into a real player, and that we can change the food system, because you can't take the existing food system and try to tweak it, and you got to jump. You got to go from using fax machines to using email. It's you can't try and tweak a fax machine until it gets as good as an email. It's never going to get there. You got to just jump tracks, okay? And you want to jump tracks onto a healthy, environmentally friendly food system, or food chain. Well, and so the first step if you sign in as club leader, and you can see the full range of products available, and you can select to create your own mini website of Jono's Food Club, and these are the products that I think that my group of people are going to buy through the club. Then you can send the link that you've now created for your mini website to your 15 people or 20 people or whatever it is, saying, "Here, guys, here's how you can source the food, and here are the prices, and it all gets maintained in one place, and you don't have to manage that." Now, just think about doing that yourself right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely doing it, but I think I might have more than 15 people.
No, sure. You have to make an Excel spreadsheet, put all the information on that Excel spreadsheet, send it to people. It's a huge amount of work and confusion behind that. Then each member can go on, and just like they would if they were at Takealot, tick what they want, what quantities they want, and then send that through to you. And then you can collate it all, and later on the system will do this, but right in the beginning stages you will still be a bit more hands-on involved, and send the orders through to the farmers. The farmers then deliver to you, and your members come and collect from you. And then it gets distributed. And that way we can find the people who are interested in food and interested in food as health, and get them to build this with us.
Lekker. I mean, that's really the most exciting part of it, is that, and I think we discussed this offline, or maybe I mentioned it already, but the cauliflower thing, like consumers really do vote best with their wallets, and if consumers drive it by just demanding what they want, everything else has to satisfy their demand, and that's just the nature of economics, So this is super cool. I'm really excited, and I think we'll end it on that note, Andrew. It's been amazing having you on the show and sharing all of your wisdom. Last thing is, where do we find out? When you launch this app, how do we find out about it? Like, is there a website we can go and pre-book or pre-order? We'll be coming to you. Okay.
You're on our list, we'll be using you can join up as a member, as a concerned consumer on the regenagsa.org.za website. One of the criteria we have there as a member, it's free membership, is concerned consumer. They're producers, they're academics, etc. So you can join up there. You can join up on our Facebook group, which has the advantage of you'll get lots of interesting articles and videos shared from all around the world about regenerative agriculture. So we'll be using those channels to start with. We've already had contact with a number of people. I mean, who are very keen to get involved in this, and we're going to grow from there. We're going to start here in the Western Cape because we already have the infrastructure of our own club to work off the back of. As I said, our hope is that there are lots of little farmers out there who are half regenerative, quarter regenerative, and if we can get together with them and link them up with consumers, we can make them fully regenerative.
That's very exciting. Yeah, I'm very excited about all of this. So thanks very much for coming and giving us your time to share, and we will definitely be having you back. Maybe you can be a guest on the show when I launch my food club. It's the most exciting thing. Okay.